The men of the U.S. 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions first realized just how thin the Sherman's armor really was, not in a briefing room, but in the hedgerows of Normandy, where the fog lifted on the morning of June 9, 1944, to reveal a battlefield designed to kill tanks. The bocage was a maze of earthen walls, tight lanes, sunken roads, and fields so enclosed that a Sherman could roll forward 20 feet and be staring down the barrel of a Panzer IV or a Pak 40 anti-tank gun hidden behind a hedge no thicker than a man's chest. The crews had trained for desert warfare, for open maneuver, for long-range gunnery ranges in England. They had not trained for this. Private First Class John McElroy of the 745th Tank Battalion recalled the moment his commander saw the first Sherman knocked out near Audeville-la-Hubert. "The shell went through us like we were made of paper." And he wasn't exaggerating. The Sherman's glacis, 51 millimeters at 56 degrees, might have looked good on paper. But the German 75mm KWK-40L-48 mounted on the Panzer IV and the nearly identical Pak 40 anti-tank gun could punch through that armor at ranges of 1,200 to 1,500 meters. In the open, that meant a duel. In Normandy, that meant slaughter. On June 10th, a platoon from the 3rd Armored Division rolled toward Caumont when a Pak 40 hidden behind a camouflage hedgerow fired 3 rapid shots. The first round hit the lead Sherman's glacis and penetrated clean through, killing the driver instantly. The second punched through the assistant driver's position. The third ricocheted inside the turret, igniting stored ammunition. The tank brewed up in under 30 seconds. German gunners laughed. To them, the Sherman was predictable, thinly armored, gasoline-fueled, and easy to burn. The nickname Tommy Cooker, once reserved for British Churchills and Cromwells in North Africa, now spread among German crews to describe the American tank, a vehicle that cooked its crew the moment it was hit. But American tankers were quick learners, and they were angry. In the hedgerow fighting around St. Lo, they noticed something strange. Shermans that happened to carry spare track blocks on the front hull sometimes survived hits that would have killed others. On June 12 near Trevière, a Sherman of the 741st Tank Battalion took a frontal hit from what survivors believed was a Panzer IV. The round struck a row of spare track links bolted to the glacis. The track shattered. The tank didn't. The round failed to penetrate. The crew lived. 2 days later, another Sherman from the 2nd Armored Division survived a 75mm APC-BC round because it struck an area where 2 spare track shoes had been welded by a crewman who disliked the way they rattled on the fenders. The idea spread like wildfire. Sherman crews began welding track blocks directly onto the hull, first as improvisation, then as a habit, then as doctrine. In the fields around St. Lo, tank maintenance teams worked into the night, scavenging discarded tracks from wrecked vehicles, heating them with cutting torches, and welding them to the glacis of every Sherman they could find. Some crews bolted them instead, hammering pins into place while artillery whistled overhead. Others welded pieces of bogie wheels, spare road wheels, even fragments of destroyed Panzer IV side skirts. Anything that could add steel became armor. The 3rd Armored Division's after-action report from June 1944 noted, "Field application of additional track links has proven effective in defeating incoming 75mm fire at extended ranges." German tankers soon noticed the change. In early July, during fighting near Carentan, a Panzer IV of the 12th SS Hitlerjugend Division fired at a Sherman from roughly 1,300 meters. The gunner expected a kill. Instead, the round struck a welded patch of track and bounced off at an angle. The Sherman fired back and withdrew behind the hedgerow. The German gunner was stunned. It wasn't that the Sherman had suddenly become a tiger, it was simply tougher than it used to be. Despite the small psychological advantage the Americans gained, the reality remained brutal. Even with added track armor, the Sherman was still vulnerable. On June 19th, near Saint-Fromond, 3 Shermans advanced along a narrow lane when a Pak 40 opened fire. The first tank, despite its improvised armor, was hit at the turret ring and destroyed. But something had changed. The 2nd and 3rd tank both managed to reverse and escape, something far less common in the opening days of Normandy. Tankers understood the truth. Track armor wasn't perfect, but it bought time. seconds, sometimes minutes, and in tank combat, seconds meant survival. By the end of June 1944, the practice had become so widespread that depot personnel at Isigny and Omaha Beach began stockpiling damaged track sections specifically to supply frontline tank units. Welding crews moved from battalion to battalion, reinforcing every Sherman that came through the workshops. In some units, not a single tank rolled into battle without at least 10 spare track shoes welded onto the glacis. German tankers saw the change firsthand during the battles around St. Lo. A Panzer IV gunner later recalled, "Some American tanks now carried many tracks on the nose. We needed closer distance for penetration." And that was the key. The Sherman didn't stop German shells entirely. It simply forced Panzer IVs and PaK 40s to get closer, exposing themselves to return fire from the 75mm M3 gun or from flanking infantry equipped with bazookas. Normandy was still deadly. Sherman crews still died in burning tanks. But the balance had shifted, slightly yet significantly, because American crews refused to accept the Sherman's weakness and instead welded their survival onto the front of their tanks. And soon the Germans, who once laughed, would learn that those crude pieces of track could mean the difference between a quick kill and a tank that kept coming. The improvised armor was only the beginning. The real transformation was still ahead, as the Shermans pushed into the hell of the bocage, and the Americans learned how to turn weakness into strength.
The American armored force did not wait for permission to solve its problems, and nowhere was that more evident than in the improvised workshops that sprang to life across Normandy in July 1944. Makeshift sanctuaries of steel, sweat, and desperation, where welding torches burned through the night and crews rebuilt their Shermans into something the Germans no longer recognized. These weren't factories. They were orchards, barns, roadside clearings, and church courtyards where tanks rolled in smoking and battered from hedgerow combat, and rolled out hours later armored in a patchwork of scavenged iron, welded track blocks, and battlefield grit. The transformation began with necessity. The Sherman's 51mm frontal armor had proven insufficient against the 75mm PaK 40 and Panzer IV's KWK 40 guns that seemed to lurk behind every hedgerow. German gunners did not need close range. At 1,200 meters, the PaK 40 could send an APCBC round straight through the glacis and out the back of the tank. The survivors of those impacts, if there were survivors, could testify that something had to change. In the first days of July, the maintenance crews of the 2nd Armored Division set the standard. At a repair point near Villiers-Fossard, Staff Sergeant Carl Dupree of the 702nd Ordnance Light Maintenance Company began welding double layers of spare track links onto the front of Shermans rolling in from the line. The idea was simple. More steel meant more resistance, but the execution was challenging. Track links from Sherman tanks were made of manganese steel, notoriously difficult to weld. The first attempts cracked under stress. Dupree and his team solved the problem by preheating the track sections with blowtorches, allowing the welds to fuse properly. Before long, they were producing reinforced Shermans faster than crews could bring them in. News of Dupree's method spread like wildfire. Soon the 3rd Armored Division, the famous Spearhead, adopted the practice at their workshops near Le Désert. Technicians welded not just tracks, but road wheels, bogey arms, Panzer IV Schürzen plates, and even steel beams ripped from collapsed farmhouses. Drivers arriving with damaged tanks joked that their Shermans were becoming Frankensteins, ugly, misshapen things built from the dead. But every man knew why it mattered. More armor meant more chances to get home alive. At the same time, crews were learning through experience what worked and what didn't. Track blocks welded horizontally tended to angle incoming rounds upward, sometimes ricocheting them over the turret. Vertical patterns dissipated kinetic energy more effectively. Crews experimented. Patterns emerged.
The most common reinforcement by mid-July was 6 to 8 track shoes on the glacis, arranged in 2 horizontal lines, and 4 to 6 on each side of the hull, placed over ammunition racks and fuel tanks. These improvised defenses did not make a Sherman invulnerable. They made it unpredictable. German gunners who had once relied on the certainty of penetration now found themselves firing at tanks that did not react as expected. Reports from the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend in mid-July noted, American tanks display welded plates and tracks on frontal armor. Penetration at long range is reduced. But the real advantage came in the bocage. In the close quarters of Normandy's dense hedgerows, tank duels happened often at ranges under 300 meters. At such distances, even with added armor, the Sherman remained vulnerable, but not as vulnerable as before. A Sherman that might have been destroyed by the first AP round from a Panzer IV could now survive long enough for the gunner to fire back, or for infantry to flank the German position with bazookas. A single second of survival was enough to win or lose a fight in the hedgerows. That single second was exactly what track armor bought. American tankers quickly became students of survival. Sergeant Bill Henderson of the 67th Armored Regiment wrote that crews began searching knocked-out German tanks for anything metal and heavy. He described finding a Panzer IV with its side skirts blown off, the armor plates lying in a ditch. His crew tore them free, dragged them across a field under sniper fire, and welded them onto their Sherman the same night. If the crowd built it to stop Russian guns, it can damn well help stop theirs too. In early July, during fierce fighting near Le Mesnil-Adelaide, a Sherman of Combat Command A took a hit from a Pak-40 at roughly 800 meters. The round struck a welded road wheel bolted to the glacis, shattered it, and failed to penetrate the hull. The crew stayed in the fight. They later reported killing the German gun crew with HE rounds. Stories like this spread through armored battalions, boosting morale in a theater where tankers often joked grimly that Sherman crews had life expectancies measured in seconds during an ambush. By mid-July, American field commanders recognized the growing importance of improvised armor. General Maurice Rose of the 3rd Armored Division formally noted that track armor significantly improves survivability at combat ranges typical of Normandy. The Ordnance Department was slower to acknowledge it, but the men on the ground didn't wait for official policy. They kept welding. By the time the Americans approached Saint-Lô, many Sherman tanks looked nothing like the clean-lined vehicles photographed in training manuals. They were beasts, scarred, uneven, thickened with steel scavenged from friend and foe alike. And yet, beneath the crude appearance, these modifications were not random acts of desperation. They were the first stage of a transformation. A tank that had once been mocked by German crews was slowly becoming something else, a machine whose crews refused to let it die easily. Normandy had taught the Americans a brutal lesson. Armor is never enough. You either improve it or you burn. And the Shermans rolling towards Saint-Lô were looking like tanks whose crews intended to survive, whatever the Germans threw at them next.
By mid-July 1944, something subtle but unmistakable had changed on the battlefield. German tank crews who once mocked the Sherman as a fragile, gasoline-filled Tommy cooker were beginning to hesitate. Panzer gunners who once fired with absolute confidence at 1,200 to 1,500 meters were now reporting ricochets, deflections, and incomplete penetrations. Officers who once treated the Sherman as an easy kill were now warning their crews to close distance before engaging. No single order captured the shift better than the entry recorded in the war diary of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend on 22 July 1944. Enemy tanks carry welded track links on the frontal armor. Long-range penetration with KWK-40 is unreliable. For the first time in the campaign, German tank crews realized the Americans had solved one of the Sherman's greatest weaknesses, not with factory upgrades,
but with the battlefield itself. The first major moment of shock came near Hebekravon on 16 July, when a Panzer IV from Panzerlehr engaged two Shermans across an open field. The German gunner, Gefreiter Ulrich Kramer, later told interrogators that he fired at 1,300 meters, well within the weapon's lethal range. The APC-BC round hit squarely on the glacis of the lead tank. Sparks flew, a chunk of track tore loose. The Sherman kept moving. Kramer fired again, another hit, no penetration. By the time he fired a third round, the second Sherman flanked his position and forced the crew to bail out. After the war, Kramer wrote simply, "We fired as trained, but the American tank was not the same as in June." Incidents like this were not isolated. On 23 July, during the approach to Saint-Lô, a Sherman of the 67th Armored Regiment survived 3 frontal hits at roughly 1,000 meters. The division's after-action report stated the reason bluntly. Improvised track armor absorbed energy from 2 hits. Third round struck at an angle due to welded shoes. For tankers who had watched friends die inside burning Shermans only weeks earlier, this was nothing short of miraculous. The sense of helplessness began to fade. Confidence returned, cautiously but undeniably. Meanwhile, German technical officers began examining knocked out and abandoned U.S. tanks more closely. They noted the armor patterns, measured the thickness of added steel, and recalculated penetration tables. Analysts of Panzergruppe West estimated that track armor increased the effective resistance of the Sherman glacis by 20 to 40 millimeters depending on angle and welding technique, enough to degrade long-range penetration from the PaK-40 and Panzer IV's KWK-40. The PaK-40 was still deadly, the Panzer IV was still lethal, but the clear overmatch they enjoyed in June had narrowed, not eliminated but narrowed. To German tactical planners, that meant one thing: the Americans were adapting faster than expected. The psychological effect was enormous. Before July, many German tankers considered the Sherman a nuisance, something to be swept aside, unless backed by British Fireflies or tank destroyers. But now, after multiple reports of Shermans surviving long-range hits, German gunners began holding fire until 800 meters or less, dangerously close in the bocage, where American infantry armed with bazookas could ambush them from 10 meters away. What had been a comfortable engagement distance had now become a killing zone. American units quickly noticed the shift. Lieutenant Aaron Kaplan of the 3rd Armored Division wrote in his journal, "We see the panzers trying to close the distance now. They're aggressive, but no longer certain." That uncertainty became costly for the Germans. At Le Désert, a Panzer IV attempted to close to 600 meters to ensure penetration on a Sherman reinforced with 3 layers of welded track. As the Panzer advanced through a narrow lane, infantry of the 26th Infantry Regiment struck from both sides with bazookas. The Panzer was immobilized and abandoned. The Sherman survived the engagement and later helped evacuate wounded soldiers. But the most dramatic demonstration of Germany's shifting perception occurred during the fighting north of Perrier on 28 July 1948. A platoon from the U.S. 4th Armored Division engaged 2 Panzer IVs at roughly 1,200 meters across open farmland. The Germans fired first. The lead Sherman was hit twice on the glacis. Both rounds struck welded track sections. Both failed to penetrate. As the Shermans closed the distance, the German tanks attempted to withdraw, but too late. A combination of HE rounds and machine gun fire forced the German crews to bail out. Post-battle inspection revealed that without the welded track armor, the Sherman would have been destroyed by the first shot. Instead, it led the attack. The effect of these encounters spread quickly through German units. A technical note from the 2nd Panzer Division stated, "Enemy tanks display improvised armor adjustments which reduce effectiveness of standard AP rounds at distance." Meanwhile, American confidence surged. Tankers no longer felt condemned to die in a vehicle the enemy mocked. Sergeant Harold Weston of the 745th Tank Battalion said it best in a letter home, "We don't take hits as easy as before. The Krauts don't laugh anymore." By early August, as Operation Cobra began to tear open the German lines west of Saint-Lô, the full effect of improvised armor was visible across the battlefield. Shermans rolled into battle covered in welded tracks, Panzer road wheels, scrap steel, spare plates from wrecked German tanks, even cut down boiler sections from French farms. Some looked monstrous, lopsided, lumpy, patched together, but every crew knew the truth behind the ugliness. Every added pound of steel meant another chance to live. And as the Americans prepared to break out of the bocage and into the open country where tanks could maneuver freely, the Germans had to face a new reality. Their once mocked opponent had changed. Sherman armor was no longer fixed, no longer predictable, no longer weak in the ways they had depended on. The battlefield had forced the Americans to evolve, and the results were starting to show. The Germans had stopped laughing, and soon, as the breakout into Brittany and the drive toward the Seine began, they would learn just how dangerous a Sherman could be when its crew refused to die quietly.
By early August 1944, the Normandy campaign had entered a new and violent phase. The hedgerows were breaking open, German lines were collapsing under the weight of Operation Cobra, and U.S. armored divisions were finally beginning to fight in the type of terrain Shermans had been designed for. Open country, where maneuver mattered more than ambush angles. But the Germans were not done. Panzer Lehr, 2nd Panzer Division, 116th Panzer, and remnants of the 12th SS had pulled back toward Argentan and Falaise, forming a desperate defensive ring to hold the last escape corridor for tens of thousands of German troops retreating east. In these chaotic battles, improvised track armor proved not only useful, it became battlefield legend. Shermans that had entered Normandy as thin-skinned, lightly protected vehicles were now rolling into the Falaise battles looking like iron monsters, their hulls and turrets layered with welded track blocks, Panzer road wheels, sheets of salvaged armor, and sometimes even entire Schürzen plates scavenged from destroyed German tank destroyers. They were ugly, they were heavy, they were slower, but they refused to die. The men of the 3rd Armored Division, fighting near Les Déserts and Rancé, were among the first to report a startling pattern. German gunners began firing more urgently at Shermans that looked heavily reinforced, sometimes choosing them before thinner vehicles simply because they appeared tougher. One tanker joked bitterly, "Krauts shoot the ugliest tank first." But that ugly armor saved lives. On 7 August 1944, during the German counteroffensive known as Operation Lüttich, the desperate attempt to cut the U.S. line at Mortain, Shermans of the 30th Infantry Division's attached tank battalions were hit by waves of Panzer IVs, Panthers, and assault guns, fighting under cover of morning fog. A Sherman of the 743rd Tank Battalion took 2 hits from a Panzer IV at an estimated 900 meters. Both rounds struck welded track links and a spare bogie wheel that had been added only days earlier. One round shattered the road wheel but failed to penetrate. The second round hit a double layer of track, cracked it apart, and ricocheted into the dirt. The tank backed into cover, its crew shaken but alive. 15 minutes later, the same Sherman re-engaged and helped disable the Pak-40 covering the German advance. Its gunner later wrote, "That damn track saved us, no question." Similar incidents occurred across the front. Near Barenton, a Sherman of the 3rd Armored Division survived a frontal hit from a Stug 3 at 1,100 meters. The 75mm round struck directly on a section of Panther Schürzen plate the crew had welded on the night before using steel ripped from a destroyed German tank destroyer. The Schürzen plate bent inward, cracked and fell off, but the Sherman's glacis remained intact. For German crews, such events were deeply frustrating. They were trained on penetration tables, muzzle velocities, and armor slope calculations that assumed the Sherman frontal armor was uniform. But the improvised armor ruined those assumptions. No 2 Shermans looked alike, no 2 impact points behaved the same. The Panzer IV gunner who had confidently fired on thin-skinned American tanks in Tunisia now found himself engaging vehicles whose armor thickness he couldn't predict, and whose weak points were often hidden under several layers of welded steel. During the chaotic closing of the Falaise pocket in mid-August, German documents began acknowledging the problem. A report from 116th Panzer Division stated, "American tanks increasingly reinforced with track links on hull and turret. Long-range fire less effective. Engagement distance must be reduced."
Reducing distance, however, was suicide. At close range, bazooka teams and American infantry were lethal. At long range, reinforced Shermans could now survive the first hit and shoot back. In the swirling battles around Chambois and Saint-Lambert-sous-Dève, tank duels erupted across fields choked with smoke, wrecks, and fleeing German columns. One Sherman from the 2nd Armored Division fought off 3 separate attacks by retreating Panthers. The first Panther fired at 1,400 meters, its round smashing into a welded track plate and ricocheting upward. The second Panther fired at roughly 1,000 meters, striking the reinforced turret cheek and gouging a deep crater but failing to penetrate. The crew commander, Lieutenant Joseph Klein, kept firing and knocked out the second Panther with a side shot moments later. The third Panther tried to close distance but was hit by artillery before it could engage. Klein later said, "If we hadn't welded that steel on, we'd be dead 3 times over." As the breakout surged east, Sherman crews grew bolder. Tankers began scavenging not only tracks, but large sheets of boilerplate, farm machinery parts, and even steel doors from barns and workshops. The extra weight sometimes overstressed the suspension, but crews accepted that risk. Survival was worth a broken bogey. Meanwhile, German morale slowly eroded. Panthers and Panzer IVs that had once dominated long-range fights suddenly found themselves in duels they could no longer predict. A Panzer commander captured near Trun admitted, "The Americans improve their tanks every week. We do not know what they will look like when we see them again." For the Americans, the psychological reversal was enormous. The tank once mocked by Germans was no longer the helpless underdog. It had become a stubborn, resilient brawler, capable of taking hits, giving hits, and surviving battles that once seemed hopeless. The improvised armor did not make the Sherman a match for the Panther or Tiger head-on, but it narrowed the gap enough for American tactics, speed, numbers, and coordination to dominate. And now, as U.S. forces pushed toward the Seine, the Sherman was no longer fighting for survival, it was fighting for victory. What had begun as desperation welding in the hedgerows had transformed into battlefield adaptation that the Germans could neither predict nor counter. And in the next phase of the war, the brutal drive toward the German border, that adaptation would prove more important than ever. By September 1944, as the U.S. Army surged toward the German border, the improvised armor that had begun as a desperate necessity in the hedgerows of Normandy had become a defining feature of the Sherman and a symbol of American adaptation in the face of German firepower. What started as scattered welding jobs in orchards and barnyards was now universal across armored divisions from Brittany to Belgium. Shermans rolled eastward, covered in a chaotic mosaic of spare track blocks, salvaged bogey wheels, chunks of Panzer armor, and steel plates stolen from French workshops, ugly but unmistakably tougher. And as the fighting moved into the Siegfried Line and the frozen hell of the Hürtgen forest, this improvised armor would once again justify every hour spent welding in the Norman night. The Siegfried Line was not hedgerow country. It was concrete dragon's teeth, fortified bunkers, forested hills, and narrow towns where every street became a shooting gallery. German anti-tank guns, PaK 40s, PaK 38s, and the dreaded 88mm flak converted to ground fire were positioned to fire from 1,500 meters or more, killing Shermans before they could even identify the threat. Yet despite the heavier firepower they now faced, Sherman crews discovered something remarkable. The improvised armor still mattered. In late September, near Aachen, a Sherman of the 745th Tank Battalion advanced toward the village of Alsdorf when it was hit by 2 PaK 40 rounds from roughly 1,200 meters. Both shots struck the glacis, hitting a double layer of track that had been welded on 2 weeks earlier. The first round shattered the track and deflected upward. The second round cratered the remaining steel but did not penetrate. The crew backed off, stunned but alive. The battalion commander wrote in his daily report, "Track armor saved this tank outright." German reactions grew increasingly grim. At a briefing of the 9th Panzer Division, officers were told that American Shermans no longer fall reliably to long-range fire. A field note from a Panzer IV company in early October stated, "Enemy tanks must be engaged at close range to ensure destruction. Improvised armor creates inconsistent results." That inconsistency was the key. The Germans no longer trusted their penetration tables, charts once considered gospel. With every welded Sherman they faced, their certainty shrank. Their gunners hesitated. Their commanders grew cautious. On the American side, the psychological shift was profound. A tank that could survive a frontal hit, even once, was a tank worth fighting in. Crews who once felt like bait now felt like contenders. And nowhere was this more evident in the forests of Hürtgen, a nightmare of mud, mines, fog, and tree bursts that shattered entire companies. Tanks were forced into narrow forest trails where German anti-tank teams waited with Panzerfausts. Armor was hit not at 1,200 meters, but at 30 meters. Even here, track armor bought time. On 21 November, a Sherman of the 3rd Armored Division was ambushed by a Panzerfaust at close range. The warhead struck a welded road wheel on the lower hull, detonated against it, and blew the wheel apart, but did not breach the fighting compartment. The crew escaped with minor injuries. One wrote later, "Someone else's wheel saved our lives." As winter closed in and the Ardennes offensive erupted on 16 December 1944, the Shermans again entered a deadly duel with German armor, not just Panzer IVs and Stugs, but Panthers and Tiger I tanks capable of killing a Sherman frontally at over a mile. No amount of welded tracks could save a Sherman from an 88mm at close range. Crews knew that, but they also understood that in a battle defined by poor visibility, forest fighting, and ambushes, surviving the first hit could mean everything. On 19 December, in the defense of Vith, a Sherman of the 7th Armored Division took a glancing hit from a Panther at 900 meters. The round struck 2 layers of welded track, shattered them, scarred the glacis, and ricocheted off. The crew immediately threw smoke and withdrew to cover. Without the improvised armor, that first shot would have been fatal. Sherman crews now welded tracks around the turret face, on the gun mantlet, and over the sponsons. Some tanks were so heavily covered in spare track, the German infantry called them Eiseneagle, iron hedgehogs. American tankers embraced the term. They had become armored porcupines, bristling with steel teeth meant to deflect death. Even in the harshest fighting of the Ardennes, evidence of their success accumulated. A 14 January 1945 report from 8th Corps recorded 7 Sherman crews who survived direct hits because track armor absorbed the initial impact of German AP rounds. One tank from the 6th Armored Division survived 5 hits during the drive toward Bastogne, 3 from POC 40s, 2 from a Stug 3, because all 5 rounds struck reinforced areas. The tank was battered, shaking, nearly inoperable, but its crew lived. German technical intelligence reports captured early in 1945 complained that Sherman modifications were unpredictable, varied, and increasingly difficult to defeat at range. A Tiger commander captured near Schönberg admitted, "We can no longer assume a kill with the first shot. Some American tanks require 2 or 3. This changes our tactics." Changing German tactics meant changing German survival. Every extra second a Sherman lived was a second a bazooka team could flank a Panther, a second artillery could shift fire, a second infantry could suppress the gunner. Improvised armor did not make the Sherman invincible, but it made the battlefield less predictable for the Germans and more survivable for the Americans. By the time U.S. forces crossed the Rhine in March 1945, nearly every Sherman bore the scars or the reinforcements of months of battlefield adaptation. Some had track armor neatly welded in rows. Others were covered in chaotic layers of salvaged steel. A few carried so much added weight that mechanics joked they should be reclassified as heavy tanks. But factory design no longer mattered. What mattered was that American tankers had rewritten their own armor, forged in battle and welded by hand, under fire, in the mud, darkness, and terror of the European campaign. When the war finally ended, many Shermans were stripped of their improvised armor for transport home or for redeployment. But the men who survived never forgot what those crude steel plates had given them. In veteran interviews decades later, Sherman crewmen spoke not of the tank's thin armor, but of the armor they built themselves. As one crewman from the 3rd Armored Division said in 1984, "They laughed at our tanks. We welded until they stopped laughing."